Imagine a war that lasted nearly 100 years. A conflict so widespread and devastating that it completely emptied vast stretches of the American wilderness, scattering entire nations of people to the winds and reshaping the geopolitical map of a continent. It was a struggle characterized by complex diplomacy, shifting alliances, and a level of brutality that terrified the superpowers of Europe. You might expect a conflict of this magnitude to be fought over gold, or religion, or the crown of a king. But this century of bloodshed, known to historians as the Beaver Wars, was fought primarily over a rodent. It is a chapter of North American history that often gets glossed over in high school textbooks, condensed into a few paragraphs about fur traders and canoes. But the reality of the 17th century in the Great Lakes region was far darker and more significant. It was a time when an indigenous superpower, the Iroquois Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee, rose to challenge not only their tribal neighbors but the might of the French Empire itself. This is the story of how the demand for fashion in the streets of Paris and London ignited a firestorm in the ancient forests of New York and Canada. To understand how this happened, we have to look at the world of the early 1600s. In Europe, the felt hat had become the ultimate status symbol. It was durable, it was waterproof, and it was in high demand. The best material for making this felt was the soft underfur of the beaver. But Europe had hunted its own beaver population to near extinction. When French and Dutch traders arrived in North America, they didn't just find a new world. They found a gold mine of fur. For the indigenous peoples of the Northeast, these European newcomers brought iron tools, brass kettles, and eventually firearms. A trade network rapidly formed. The Europeans needed pelts. The indigenous tribes needed European technology to survive and compete. At the center of this storm was the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations of the Iroquois. Their territory, located in what is now upstate New York, was perfectly situated militarily, but poorly situated economically. By 1640, the beaver population in their own lands had been hunted out. Meanwhile, their neighbors to the north, the Huron Wendat, controlled the trade routes to the French and had access to the fur-rich territories of the Canadian Shield. The Iroquois faced a crisis. Without furs, they could not buy the guns and powder they needed to defend themselves. They were surrounded by enemies and faced with the prospect of becoming irrelevant. Their solution was drastic and terrifyingly effective. If they could not trap the beaver themselves, they would seize the trade routes and destroy the middlemen. The conflict truly began with a single gunshot decades earlier, in 1609. The French explorer Samuel de Champlain, seeking to cement an alliance with the Huron and Algonquin, joined them on a raid against the Mohawks, the easternmost tribe of the Iroquois. On the shores of Lake Champlain, the groups met. The Iroquois chiefs, wearing wood armor, advanced with confidence. Champlain stepped forward, raised his arquebus, and fired. The shot, loaded with multiple balls, killed 2 chiefs instantly and mortally wounded a third. The Iroquois, who had never seen firearms, fled in terror. That moment changed everything. It created a deep, century-long enmity between the Iroquois and the French. But more importantly, it taught the Iroquois a lesson they would never forget. They needed guns. By the 1640s, the Iroquois had secured a trade relationship with the Dutch at Fort Orange, present-day Albany. The Dutch, less concerned with missionary work than the French and more focused on profit, were willing to sell muskets to the Iroquois in large numbers. Armed and desperate, the 5 nations went on the offensive. This wasn't just a war for economic dominance. It was also a mourning war. Iroquois culture dictated that the spirits of those killed in battle must be appeased by replacing them with captives from enemy tribes. These captives would either be ritually tortured and executed, or adopted into the tribe to replace the dead. As European diseases like smallpox tore through the Iroquois longhouses, the need for captives to replenish their dwindling population became an obsession. The violence escalated in 1649 with a campaign of shocking efficiency. The Iroquois launched a massive winter invasion of the Huron-Wendat homeland in present-day Ontario. Usually, warfare halted during the deep snows, but the Iroquois changed the rules. They burned villages, breached palisades, and shattered the Huron Confederacy. Thousands were killed or taken captive. The rest fled west or sought protection under the French. The destruction of the Huron created a power vacuum. The Iroquois didn't stop there. Over the next decade, they systematically dismantled the Petun, the Neutral Nation, and the Erie. These were not small skirmishes. They were wars of annihilation. The entire Ohio Valley was largely depopulated, becoming a hunting ground for the Iroquois. Refugees from dozens of tribes fled west to the other side of Lake Michigan, creating a chaotic mix of displaced peoples. For the French in Canada, the situation was dire. Their native allies were destroyed, their trade was strangled, and the Iroquois warriors were now appearing at the very gates of Montreal and Quebec City. The French colonists lived in constant fear. The psychological toll was immense. A farmer going to his field might never return. A family eating dinner might be the target of a sudden raid. By the 1660s, New France was on the brink of collapse. The King of France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, decided he had to intervene. He sent the Carignan-Salieres Regiment, over 1,000 elite soldiers, to Canada. It was the first time a professional European army had been deployed on North American soil. They marched into Iroquois territory, burning crops and villages. While they rarely caught the elusive warriors, the destruction of food stores forced the Iroquois to the negotiating table, at least for a while. But the peace was fragile. The war dragged on through the 1680s, evolving into a stalemate of raids and counter-raids. The English replaced the Dutch in New York, becoming the new suppliers of arms to the Iroquois and using them as a proxy force against the French. One of the most horrific events occurred in August 1689, known as the Lachine Massacre. 1,500 Mohawk warriors struck a settlement just outside Montreal at dawn. They burned 56 homes and killed or captured dozens of settlers. The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the colony, leading to harsh retaliatory raids by the French against Iroquois villages. However, time was not on the side of the Five Nations. A century of constant warfare had bled them dry. Despite their skill and ferocity, they could not sustain the losses. Disease continued to ravage their population. Furthermore, the French had learned to fight like the indigenous people, adopting guerrilla tactics and using their own native allies to strike deep into Iroquois lands. By the turn of the 18th century, a weariness had settled over the region. The Iroquois realized that being the hammer between the French anvil and the English anvil was a dangerous position. They needed a new strategy. In the summer of 1701, a remarkable event took place. The Great Peace of Montreal. 1,300 delegates from 40 different indigenous nations arrived in Montreal. It was a diplomatic gathering of a scale never before seen in North America. The Iroquois, the French, and the various tribes of the Great Lakes gathered to bury the hatchet. The negotiations were tense and difficult, taking weeks to conclude. But in the end, a treaty was signed. The Iroquois agreed to remain neutral in wars between the British and the French. In exchange, they were allowed access to the fur trade networks they had fought so hard to control. The Great Peace of 1701 effectively ended the Beaver Wars. The conflict had lasted nearly a century. It had resulted in the destruction of multiple indigenous confederacies, the stalling of French colonial expansion, and the permanent alteration of the ecosystem. The beaver eventually returned to the streams of the Northeast, but the people who had lived there for centuries often did not. The Iroquois emerged from the war as a cemented geopolitical power, holding the balance of power between the French and British for another 50 years. They had survived, but at a terrible cost. Today, looking at the quiet forests of the St. Lawrence Valley or the Finger Lakes region of New York, it is hard to imagine the scale of the violence that once consumed them. The Beaver Wars serve as a stark reminder of how global economics, the desire for a hat in Paris, can destroy and reshape worlds on the other side of the ocean. It is a story of survival, adaptation, and the devastating collision of cultures, a hidden history that defined the destiny of North America. Thanks for watching. If you learned anything, or if I at least entertained you today, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing. The almighty algorithm decides who gets recommended my videos based on the amount of views versus likes and subscriptions. I wish I didn't have to ask, but please do consider pressing like and subscribe.